Welcome back to another episode of the Startup Therapy Podcast. This is Ryan Rutan, joined as always by Wil Schroter, the founder and CEO of startups.com. Will, as startup founders, I think we all sort of love to romanticize the what if, right? It's part and parcel with what we do. But recently, I think you've hit a couple milestones where you sat back a little bit and really put some time and thought into what if on the what ifs, like what if I had done something different?
Yeah.
Like so it'd be fun today just to kind of walk through some of that, because I think as founders, we all face these things, and it can create a lot of consternation, can create a lot of regret. And so let's unpack this and give people a realistic view of what the F with the what ifs.
I think people, like in our business in startups, we are in the business of what if. What if we had done this?
Yes,
What if we had
quite
raised
literally.
capital? What if we had sold? What if we had started early? What if?
Yeah.
What if? I think it's fascinating because for me personally, and Ryan, you and I talked about this a lot in the past year. I just turned 50 in this past year, which puts me at over 30 years of being able to analyze the what ifs. At some point, the what ifs actually happen.
Got a lot of data points.
Yeah, a lot of data points. And my career is a little unusual, similar to yours, in that all we've really been have been entrepreneurs. We've been able to look at so many different points of life and be able to say, I could have gone left, but I went right. And how did that go? What's also interesting about our perspective is we live with everyone else's what ifs. We get to live thousands of other lives through all
Fly on
these
the
other
wall
founders.
too. Lots of what ifs.
You bet. And so that gives us a unique point of validation that most founders, and certainly a lot of the founders listening, don't get, which is for us, it'd be like, oh, I could have sold and I would have been so happy. Now we saw a ton of people who sold are miserable, right? Like we get to see the what ifs. I'm really fascinated because this was unexpected. When I turned 50, I took some time to just process. And I do that every year around my birthday. I just take some time, process the past year. Usually what I'm surprised by is how much stuff you can do in a year, right? Like I don't think we give nearly enough.
That was just a year ago, right? That happened. Oh, that happened this year. Yeah.
You can live a lifetime in a year, depending on how you spend it. Anyway, so I was looking back, longer term for the first time, a big crux. And I was looking back 30 years more than 50 years, right? Because I was looking at my career years. And one of the things that surprised me that I didn't expect, didn't even see coming, was how few what ifs I had. Okay, so if I were to define that, if I were to lay that out, I would say that there's the safe route and then there's the what if. Right? The blue pill, red pill kind of situation, right? And more often than not, I always took the what the hell, let's see where this ridiculous path goes. I found that fascinating that while that leads to all kinds of trouble, I mean, by definition, it is not safe. While it leads to all kinds of trouble, and it didn't always end well. I mean, I would say statistically it ended poorly more than it ended well, but at no point could I come up with a lot of things in life, both personally and professionally, where I didn't roll the dice, where I didn't take that path and say, what? Screw it. Let's see what happens.
Yeah, so just hang on, because for everybody listening, people make it a little confusing. But you picked a path, so there's the what if to the alternate. I think what we're saying is that in general, where it was like the follow the standard path or take on risk, take on unknown. You took on risk, you took on unknown, right?
Yep.
So what we're saying is that while we don't know exactly what if Will had gone to work for Nationwide Insurance and had a corner office and, just did the 9-to-5 career thing, but we can guess a little bit better at those what ifs because it's what most people do, right?
Yep.
So just for everybody listening, that's what we're comparing and contrasting this to, which is Will with briefcase and lots of polo shirts.
Oh my God. Yeah, right. Just pause there for a second. I've got to give you in the audience a great visual. Before I started my first company when I was 19 years old, I worked at a law firm. And I mean, that sounds so prestigious, right? It was not, okay? And I'm going to make it so much worse. Right before I started Blue Diesel, my first company, I needed a temp job. And my only skill, like I went to a temp agency to get a temp job. I'm like 19 years old.
What can you do?
Yeah, my only marketable skill.
I drove here.
I can type. Oh, no, even
that's
better.
right.
No, sorry, gets better. I did not drive there because I didn't own a car, okay? So get this. This is such a low that I can't wait to share with you. I'm looking for a temp job. I have every bit of maybe $20 in my bank. And so the lady calls me up and she says, hey, good news. We found a job for you. You're going to love this at Nationwide Insurance.
Yep.
Right? It's so funny that you just said that, but that's actually what it was.
I just went with the odds. Largest employer in Columbus, Ohio. So I just went with numbers.
there's two stages. I'll whip through this, but it's a funny story. So they're like, yeah, but you have to have a suit. We assume you have a suit, and I'm like, that's a big assumption. I do not, right? That's where I got my special suit, where I went to Goodwill, and like I only had $20 to my name, so like this was a big investment, right?
But wait, Will, how were you going to make sure that you could balance that budget against needing the suit and obviously a Hawaiian shirt for Hawaiian Shirt Fridays, right? Like, no way you just spent all that on the suit, right?
I buy a suit from Goodwill for $8. It's a three-piece tweed suit from the 70s that is wildly ill-fitting. Also, what 19-year-old is wearing a three-piece suit? Like the little vest?
None.
Okay, but this is the visual I wanted to give you. I also didn't own a car. So the only way I could get from my campus apartment all the way down to Nationwide was on rollerblades. Ryan, do you remember the meme, I'm late for business?
Business guy on rollerblades. Yes. Oh my God. You were business guy on rollerblades.
Brother,
that's amazing.
And the only thing that was better was I had a fake briefcase that I had to carry with me on rollerblades. I mean, it is the meme, right? So
Did you buy the briefcase that day too?
Dude, picture this. I can't remember how I
even a briefcase was just like a facade of a briefcase.
That's what I'm saying.
It was a pizza box
standee
with a handle on it painted black.
Picture me in the dead of August. It's like 100 degrees outside in a wool three-piece suit that's tweed, rollerblading with a briefcase. Tap, tap.
No.
Yeah.
Oh God.
So
that might have been the best thing that happened in Columbus in 1993.
Let me tell you, it was sweet, and probably doing tricks on my way down. So
of course,
let me. In
case the temp job didn't work out.
So I just finished this story, although that was the story. I show up. It is an office of just me and 100 very angry women, and they saw me as like fresh meat to like lay everything, like all their issues on.
Sure.
And so I show up. They're like, "You're the new typist." They're like, "Because whoever went on maternity." And I'm like, "I guess." It's almost like out of a movie. They handed me like a 10-foot tall stack of papers, and they're like, "Type this by 4:00."
You're waiting for John Candy to walk in with the coffee, right? Like, what is happening?
It was so bad. It was. I mean, I typed the hell out of it, and those ladies loved me. But let me tell you. Also, this is totally inappropriate. I've never gotten so many back rubs in my life. I was like, I know, like totally out of bounds, but I was like, these ladies are like really nice. I was treated so well there. So when I think about the what if and I think about alternate universe, that actually happened. I actually lived my alternate universe, and it wasn't.
Okay, look, for everybody listening to the podcast right now, if you want to start fan fiction around this, I say we create a graphic novel of Will who never escaped the typing pool. Maybe worked his way up, but let's do it. Ryan at startups.com, email me. Let's get ChatGPT writing this thing for us tomorrow.
You know, when I look back at that alternate universe, and that was basically what I was doing before I started my first internet company, I look back in that and I say, holy cow, like, had I just kept down that path, and that was the only way I could eat at the time, right? Like, It wasn't like I had a lot of career options. And had I stayed down that path, like you said, not hard to think about where that goes. Like, that's got a pretty specific trajectory, and I was on it.
Be giving back rubs.
Yeah, probably. And so anyway, when we think about that, okay, when we think about shit, you know, what are all the what ifs? My what if moment at that point was, you know, I changed course and started an internet company. I dropped out of school, right? Like, that was a hard 180 from where I was at the time. Now, had I not done that, I could have made up a what if. Man, if I just started that internet company like I thought I could have started a company and it would have grown to be whatever, and it would have been like this huge outcome. Which kind of brings me to my other point, which is when we think and look back on the what ifs, the things we could have, should have done, we love to romanticize what that was going to be, that the upside of what that is. You know what I mean?
And it's so funny too, because I think that because so much of it is in our hands in the founder space, right? Or we believe that it is, right?
Yeah.
So we fantasize and we romanticize those outcomes. But in the same way that we do that with, like, within the startups, like, what if I hadn't sold, or if I had sold, or if I had, you know, I hadn't taken on that co-founder, if I had, you know, whatever. But we don't do this in the other realm, right? So we're like, okay, so if you'd stayed in that typing pool, somehow we're not going to romanticize that in the same way. It's not like, and then Will was CEO and chairman of Nationwide Insurance, because that's the same delta that we typically romanticize. We're like, we go all the way. We're like, this thing would have been the next Facebook. But weren't you running like a local digital agency? Like, forget about that. It was going to be Facebook, right? So it is so funny, man. Like how skewed that gets, and like we can't even call it rose-colored glasses. It's like a rose-colored space-mounted telescope, right?
Vortex, yeah.
Yeah,
But I think what's fascinating about that is we've got this ability to take the what if and apply an outcome that we can't possibly forecast. I'll give you the most popular ones, right? The most popular one, without question, is what if I had raised capital? What if I had raised capital? If I just raised capital, or if I just do raise capital, then all of these great things would have happened with capital.
Yep.
And I'm thinking to myself, no, they wouldn't have, right? Like, do you understand how that actually works? That doesn't mean everything's a failure. Obviously, there's great capital stories. That doesn't mean yours was going to be a great capital story, right? Like that's the part I don't get.
It wasn't. Just based on math, it wasn't going to be, right? Without knowing anything else about it, wasn't going to be.
If I had just started the opportunity, it could have become X. And I always think about that in terms of Facebook. Kind of maybe the most popular I could have done that of all time, with the answer being categorically no, you couldn't.
Right. Yeah.
So at the time, this is a great example being the Winklevoss brothers, right? Like this story's been fictionalized so many times. Who knows what's true anymore? But their idea that like had evil Mark Zuckerberg not stolen the idea, which is the big bullshit of all time, we would have had Facebook. No, you wouldn't have. Yeah, no, Cameron Tyler, you wouldn't have. And they're super smart guys, so I'm not taking anything away from them. But that was Mark's journey.
It'd be like you and I saying, if that Ryan Day hadn't taken that head coaching job, you and I could have, co-head coached the Buckeyes to a national championship this year. That would have been amazing.
Probably not. Definitely not, right? So capital being one, right? The idea being the other. If I just started this idea, etc., I look at it the opposite way. I'm so jaded by this bullshit of romanticizing the what if that I'm almost more shocked that the people who did do it. I'll give you an example. You were hanging out with us at like around that same time. Do you remember when a friend of ours that used to do marketing here, Derek Ray, was here? Do you remember?
Yes, yeah.
D-Ray? Yeah.
Yep.
And so Derek and I, are good friends with Sean Rad, the founder of Tinder. A long time ago, Sean used to work for Derek, like in a previous job. And then Sean kind of came on as the CEO, and then Derek kind of worked for Sean. And then my wife, Sarah, was Sean's first employee. Right. So I introduced Sean to Sarah and had the most hilarious interview of all time. Around that time, Derek and I are talking. He's single at the time. And we're talking about this new app that everybody's talking about called Tinder. And Derek's like, it works amazingly well. Right. Like this thing is crushing it. And I remember Sarah was like, Sean started that, right? And he's like, his just face goes white. He's like, you gotta be kidding me. Right. Now this was one of those cases where like even Sean couldn't have believed, right, that Tinder would become Tinder.
Do what it did.
Yeah. He was almost living his own alternate reality. Like, I think I told you about this, but like years later, Sean and his girlfriend at the time came over for dinner with Sarah and I. We were just catching up on how things had gone. I think I told you about his sale, or not sale, the handshake deal that wasn't, the biggest misunderstanding in business history between him and IAC. Even Sean, like anybody else, was kind of surprised it went that way. Like, even the guy that started it. And when I say that, a million people could have been like, oh, I could have done Tinder. Look, dude, even the guy who did it was surprised he did Tinder. The fact that you could have done it where he actually did do it, don't believe it, right?
It's one more version of armchair quarterbacking, and it's just as unbelievable and ludicrous.
Well, I also think that there's a part of it, like when we're thinking about that upside, it always cracks me up that same upside never seems to have any consequences attached to it, right? In other words, like, oh, I could have started it. Oh, cool. You know what you could have also done in the process? Lost your spouse through divorce, alienated all your friends, had a heart attack, lost all your money. Like, we only talk about the best cases of it. But that's what I'm saying. Like, when I think, perfect example. So after my rollerblading / typing career, right, I transfer into this internet thing. And now when I tell the story, I actually just told it on Reddit this morning, right? And it was like people were going crazy on Reddit over it, surprisingly positively, which I've never seen happen. But when I was telling this story, it's a cool story now. Like, guy it's a fundamental founder story, right? Risks everything, starts with nothing, becomes something, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, okay, yeah, the story played out, the what if played out, but do you know how much it cost me to tell that story? like how much emotional strife I went through, how much I lost in the way. Like, did you know the part where I didn't see my family for 4 years or celebrate Christmas?
Shut up, Will.
Like,
you're ruining the fantasy.
yeah, exactly. Like, that's what my point. When we create the fantasy, it's so convenient. The reason that's a problem.
It's like when I look back in time and I decide to buy stocks after I can see what they've done, my portfolio is amazing. Like
Right.
every
I just wanna
time.
buy the dips.
When I trade on a reverse time heuristic, it's perfect every time. It's amazing how good I am at it.
It's amazing. And it also forgets to calculate a few things. And by the way, like as we're going through this stuff, like, as you're listening, whatever, it's important to start to build this mental model so you can model against what if. Because what if is a dangerous place to go if you don't understand the realities of what if. What if is so much fun to say in that I became a billionaire and blah, blah, blah. What if isn't as fun, but it's more practical when you start to say, well, what would that have cost me? Something that's really funny about everything we talk about here is that none of it is new. Everything you're dealing with right now has been done 1,000 times before you, which means the answer already exists. You may just not know it, but that's okay. That's kind of what we're here to do. We talk about this stuff on the show, but we actually solve these problems all day long at groups.startups.com. So if any of this sounds familiar, stop guessing about what to do. Let us just give you the answers to the test and be done with it. I want to tell a story of where I have a what if, except I actually know what it would cost me. Okay? As we're growing Blue Diesel, we merge into another agency. That agency grows bigger. And we get to a point, we're at like 700 million in revenue where we're planning on going public. This is like 2001, 2002, if I get my dates straight, it was a long time ago. I hated it. I hated working there, right? Nothing wrong with the people, nothing wrong with the clients. I hated the services business because we were an agency, and I hated the work that we did, which was services for pharmaceutical companies. I got no problem with pharmaceutical companies as much as they're all hated in their own way. It's just boring, right? Like I just couldn't get up in the morning and being like, I want to sell more Prozac. I will make the world a happier place. But I couldn't get pumped. While the whole company is super pumped about going IPO and becoming bigger, I'm like, I need to get the fuck out of here. Like I have no interest in any of this, and this is sucking the life out of me. So here's what I'm going to paint the what if. The what if was, had I stayed there, we ended up selling it to Dan Snyder, who owns the Washington Commanders.
Yep.
And then my business partner, Blaine, who's one of the best operators I've ever seen, stayed on and took it public. Did what I would have been my what if. Ryan, here's where that's interesting. Blaine and I get together on a periodic basis, and we compare notes as to what it took and what it earned to go that path. To stay with it, run it through IP, because he did it. Like he lived my alternate life. He made gobs more money, as you tend to when you take companies public, right?
Tends to be one of the outcomes.
But holy shit, what it cost him and what he went through to get there, I would never be willing to endure. Now, I can't say whether Blaine would. I mean, he did it, right? So I'm not speaking for him. I'm saying, knowing what I know, it would have ruined me, right?
Yeah.
Like I just can't see that happening.
Not a trade-off you would want to make.
Also, I was 27. Hold on, let me just finish this one thought. I was 27 when I made that call. I would have eaten up from 27 to 37. That's how long it would take it to see that through. I would have eaten up maybe the best years of my life from like being single and doing all fun stuff to put into that. And it wouldn't have bought me a single thing because I didn't do any of that, and I got everything I wanted anyway, right? So I can't say I lost something because it was nothing I needed.
Yeah, no, I think it's so hard, especially when you look at a situation like that where there is a kind of a big and binary outcome, right? I do this, I get a bunch of money. I didn't do that, I didn't get that bunch of money. Right. I enjoyed a bunch of other stuff. Those other things are a lot harder for people to see. But I think that one of the challenges is that when we're going back, like when we're doing the revisionist history, every risk that we look at that pays off looks glamorous in hindsight. The reality is, in the moment, most of them are fucking terrifying.
Yep.
Right? You're about to, if you can even see it. Sometimes you don't see it. In that case, you saw it. You were like, stay, and we push for IPO, go, and I can just do my own thing, and I can feel good about it. Great. in some cases, we don't even necessarily know that we're at that much of an inflection point. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. Maybe like, hey, let's take on that seed round, which doesn't seem like a huge inflection point, but it's going to then mean that you're going to do your Series A and your Series B and your Series C, and now you're set on a path where there's only one outcome. And so they look great in hindsight a lot of the times. And again, like somebody said at one point, but it's like the difference between being brave and stupid depends on the outcome, right? So when we're only looking at the outcomes where we know people won, of course, every one of those decisions, every risk that was taken is going to look really glamorous. But the reality is in the moment, they are anything but.
I got to say, and maybe this is a factor of age and experience, when I see success, my very first reaction is this: at what cost?
Yeah, 100%. Like what was given up to get that?
Yep. Because at this point, just because I've been around long enough, I've met countless successful people. But I also, because of the position that we're in and the relationship we have with those folks, I get to see what it costs them. And I'll go back to, it costs them marriages. It costs them relationships with their children. It costs them sometimes their sanity, their happiness, their ability to be happy. Not in every case, right? And I'm not saying it's all bad. I'm saying you don't get to those levels without insane amounts of cost. You just don't.
Right. And by the way, that was when it worked out, right? So we're now talking about that was the success, right? Because all those same things can also be true when you fail. Right. So, yeah, no guarantees here. So we want to be careful about that. We're not saying that risk is necessarily the path.
Right.
We're exploring the what if we'd gone the other way.
To kind of wrap that part up, Ryan, what I'd say is even in the upside, there's a phenomenal amount of cost. And we have the danger of romanticizing our own outcome, choosing our own adventure, so to speak, and it always goes well, right? Like it doesn't always go well. And even when it does, there's a tremendous amount of cost. So there's a bit of a danger in looking at the what if as if, one, you were even going to get there, and two, it was going to end without the cost you think it does. I was going to say there's a fascinating other side to this that I think we should dig into, which is we also romanticize what the downside would have been. And I think we get that wrong too. You know what I mean?
100%, right? And I think that like at the beginning, the calculus looks something like, okay, what risks can I take to avoid failure, right? Like, how do I avoid failure? Which, you want to manage the downside to some degree, but it's not really what we're trying to do there, right? What we're trying to do is means that like that we can trust that we'll survive it. Right. Because I think that once we've been through enough failure, and as startup founders, there's very few degrees between us and separation between us and failure. We've all experienced it. You realize that is what it comes down to, right? It is surviving it and being around to keep going, right? We talked about this in the last podcast, right? It's like that ability to tolerate some level of risk is really what you're saying is, can I absorb this amount of risk and keep moving, right? And generally speaking, the downside isn't what we think it's going to be either.
I think that also prevents us from getting to the what if. I'll give an example that you and I have a shared experience. So when we bought Zirtual.com out of essentially what was an overnight shutdown, it was a complete shit show. We were on the tail end of someone else's nightmare. The worst thing could possibly happen is your business is growing like crazy, and then some bizarre funding event happens where the floor falls out from under you, and overnight you have to shut the thing down. I mean, that is kind of the worst case scenario as far as like, didn't see that one coming. And so we certainly feel for the founder on that. However, let's talk about how we looked at the what if of that, okay?
Yeah.
So we bought that company in an overnight sale, right? Like, I mean, when we say overnight, some of you have heard the story on the podcast, but we literally mean overnight. Like it started at 10 p.m., it ended at 9 a.m. We all of a sudden owned a company with 450 employees that we had zero diligence on Monday morning. Now, it's hard. When I say
I
it like
met
that,
a lot of people that week. A lot of phone time.
But let's talk about what actually happened, or said differently, how we process the what if of that risk, so that folks can understand that if you use a fairly reasonable gauntlet, if you will, when you put stuff through it, you can get to a better outcome. For example, Ryan, when we first looked at the asset, again, this was in a condensed period of time, but even let's say just the next day after we're like, oh shit, we own it. Do you remember how we were just downside modeling?
Yeah, that's all we were looking at because what we're trying to figure out is like, okay, it's going through a catastrophic failure,
Right.
but is this failure terminal, right? Like, what is survivable of this? Can the employees stick around or
Yep.
not? Because we didn't know that at the time, right?
Yep.
Because there were some labor law issues, all kinds of stuff. Can the employees stick around or not? If not, then what? What do we
Yep.
do? Can we staff up 450? So what's the downside look like? If none
Yep.
of those people can stay, what do we do? Are
Yep.
the clients going to stay? How many of them are going to stay? If it goes to zero income, do we still want this? What's
Yep.
the likelihood of that happening, right? So we were just looking at if you continue the trajectory that this thing is on, which was down and to the right, what happens, right? And so if we play that out and we downside model that, what do we need to be prepared for? And are we willing to tolerate that? Are we willing to adapt around the likelihood that it continues on that trajectory for at least a while?
Let's play that out. Let's run a scenario. Just so I want folks to be able to use this mechanism for themselves. I think it's incredibly valuable. A lot of people look at risk modeling like, let me see what the threshold is, at which point I walk away. And I
Yep.
get that. That's a reasonable thing to do. We look at it a bit differently, which is, hey, what is okay, yes, the downside is significant and that would hurt, but could we absorb it? Not do we
Yep.
not want it, but in the worst, if the thing goes to zero, can we friggin' figure something out? And the answer is usually yes. Okay. That's way different than, hey, this might take a loss. Of course, it might take a loss. Like literally anything could take a loss, right? WeWork took a loss. It was the biggest funding event in history at the time.
Yep.
So, of course, anything can take a loss. What we're saying is, do we have the confidence that if this thing starts to nosedive and we're pulling back on the stick, that maybe we can't pull it up, but we can at least crash land it and figure it out from there?
Yeah. Are we resilient or are we not? Right. That's kind of the question in that moment.
Right, right. And so we looked at it and we said, okay, worst case scenario, all the clients bail. All of them, there's thousands, by the way. All the clients
Yeah.
bail. Worst case scenario, all the virtual assistants bail. Not awesome either, because you kind of need them in order
Right.
to earn the money. So we look at it and say, well, what would we be left with at that point? We'd have the domain, we'd have the site traffic, we'd have the infrastructure of how billing works. So we know how to hire people. It's not like, even if they all left, like we couldn't figure out how to hire humans.
Yeah.
It would be hard. It would not exactly how we planned our day, but we could do it. Could we get more clients? Well, guess what? Most of the clients that would have just left have nothing to do with the clients that would have just shown up at the website tomorrow. So as far as
Right.
they're concerned,
Zero.
business as
Yep.
usual. As
New
far as
day.
we're concerned, business as usual, right? So for the most part, we knew there would be some level of new clients coming in the door, even if we lost all the other ones. So when we're modeling that downside, we're modeling it from the standpoint of not, oh, we don't want to take risk. It's, hey, even if we have to start shit from scratch, we can do it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the thing. I think you started to use a kind of a crashing airplane analogy before, and it's a good one, right? Because if the plane's crashing and everything's gone, the crew's gone, the fuel's gone, the engines are gone, you're still going to try to pull up on the stick, right?
Yep.
There are still things you can do to minimize that impact at that point, and you're constantly recalculating. I think that's one of the misnomers about how to handle risk is that you can somehow do all of that in the moment. You really can't. Like there is that moment. Then you have to make some decisions. You have to start moving forward because risk is dynamic, right? Because, and we knew that in that situation, perhaps one of the most dynamic risk situations I've ever been in, because it was at that point a rapidly depreciating asset because the number of staff that were going to stick around after day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4 of paused operations is going to go exponentially off a cliff. Same thing with clients, same thing with web traffic if they show up at a site where they can't buy anything, right? So all of that starts to compound, but that's why you have to recognize that it's a dynamic situation. Be willing to jump in there, to your point, say, what's the worst? Can we absorb that, knowing that that's the worst, and knowing that we're going to fight to make it not happen in the first place?
I think folks see this the most now with their startups. They say, oh, if we do X, Y, and Z and the startup fails, full apocalypse.
Yeah.
Not exactly, right? Yes, the startup goes away. Yes, that actually does happen, right? But you don't go away, right? Like it sucks. You have to let people go, which is awful. I'm not saying anything's okay about this at all, right? It sucks. But then you go do other shit. So I'll give you another example. So years before that, I started a company called Afford It, raised a bunch of money from some high profile investors like Bessemer and Founders Fund and all these folks. And it imploded. I mean, we raised like $1 million. So it wasn't like a ton of money, but it went away and it sucked. I mean, it ripped my heart out. I love when people go back and like, oh, we only raised $1 million. So it wasn't that bad. It could have been $1 billion. It did not matter. Like I ran myself through the floor for a very long time. Now, at the time, you look at that and you think that's the only outcome. Oh, if this fails, then I'm branded for life. I'm the scarlet letter of failure. Do you know, I look back on that, and that was like 15 years ago. I can barely remember it happened. I can barely remember it happened. It was like, it was the bane of my life. It was the end of my existence. And it's a footnote in how I remember my life, right?
Now, some people might say that's a trauma response, Will, and that
I'll take it. Even better. Even better.
I don't have to live with it on a daily basis.
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
Rug, right where it
Yeah.
belongs.
Super convenient. No, but I'm saying, like, it's the same way, like, you're a junior in high school and someone doesn't ask you to prom and your whole life is over. Your whole life is ruined. And then you go back later in life, you can't even remember who that person was. What we suck at as humans is modeling past the present. We have this amazing ability, and it's not always good, to model the future and the what ifs in the most fucked up way. Ways that like never are practical, never come true. And I think as founders, Ryan, that's dangerous. It's dangerous to have a broken forecasting model in a lot of ways, the way we're talking about.
It is. Well, I mean, I guess, look, if all you're doing is playing revisionist history and you're using it as some sort of cathartic process, or maybe to ignite your midlife crisis and you end up buying the sports car, whatever, cool.
Yeah,
right? I think it becomes a problem when you start to use those past what ifs to make decisions now that will have impact off into the future. You'll see this a lot, and I know it's a common problem with inexperienced traders, just to use something that people really understand well. You miss a couple of trades, and you're like, if only I'd gotten to that one at the time. If only I'd gotten to that one at the time. Well, now I got to get into this one so that this one isn't necessarily going to do what those did, right? But all of a sudden you're like, put it all there because it's going to do the same thing. Probably not, right? And so I think that when we use inaccurate heuristics, right, meaning that the revisionist history and all of what it could have been instead of just what it was.
Right.
You can use what it was. You can't use what it was and what it never became to dictate some future outcomes for something else that's entirely different. That's where it starts to get really, really dangerous. And we see founders do this a lot.
I agree. And here's the thing. I want people to get comfortable with what if, right? I want them to be able to live with what if. By doing so, I want to make sure that they don't romanticize what it could be, inappropriately, or build an apocalyptic case of the downside, which actually is never the way it's going to be. It's like when people talk about global warming and they're like, and then the seas will rise and everything, like as if no one's going to do anything about it. Like people are just going to sit in their homes and just watch the water rise and be like, oh shit, I guess in a couple of years we'll all be dead.
We'll eat boiled fish now.
Yeah. I'm like, come on, like the world responds. That's the whole thing, right? And so here's what I'd say. When I think about how I would love every founder to look at whatever their milestone is, whatever it's, 50, 100, whatever your like age or life milestone is, I want you to be not terrified of failure, of doing something wrong. I want you to be terrified of regret. I want you to be terrified of not challenging what if, not looking at the hardest things in their face and saying, fuck it, I'm going to do it anyway. When you look back and you play back your highlight reel of regret and failure, only one of those, you'll look back and say, man, I wish I did things differently. If you look back on regrets, you'll always have regrets. If you look back on failures, but you always pushed, you'll never have regrets. And to me, that's a sign of a life well lived.
Overthinking your startup because you're going it alone? You don't have to, and honestly, you shouldn't, because instead, you can learn directly from peers who've been in your shoes. Connect with bootstrapped founders and the advisors helping them win in the Startups.com community. Check out the Startups.com community at www.startups.com to see if it's for you. Could be just the thing you need. I hope to see you inside.